Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida, Department of Criminal Justice, and in this video I have an updated and expanded version of Chapter 12, Geography, Profiling, and Predatory Criminals from your criminal profiling textbook and supplemented with some more recent research. Basically, geographic profiling has become an innovative investigatory tool in the profiling field. And I was thinking about this today when I opened up one of my desk drawers and found a stack of maps that I had used throughout the years, and almost thought, well, this was my GIS system back in the 1980s and even in the 1990s. I once gave a map to a young student who had never actually used a map before, had always used their GPS system on their phone and or in their car, and was almost shocked when I talked about the 1980s and the push pins and all that. Things have changed dramatically, and they're much more sophisticated, and a lot of these techniques can be combined with other techniques to even have greater investigatory value. So we can start using network theory, we can use different layering methods, we can use satellite imageries. As soon as I talk about something today, for example, the use of drones and GIS, something new will be coming along, and this will sound like an old ancient video. And so here the profiler or the investigator is trying to understand the geographic characteristics of crime scenes as well as how the offender moves around, the mobility of the offender. Now, if you look at the role of geographical considerations, we have several. First, we can look at distance, which is relative. For example, some people will drive an hour or 4 hours and not think that's very far. Other people, 10 minutes, that's a major trip, and so on. Also, the method of transportation. There may be people who drive particular vehicles, or they may take public transportation. They may ride a bicycle. I can tell you that in my neighborhood, there appears to be some car break-ins, and the mode of transportation appears to be bicycles. Also, the attractiveness of the origins, the destinations and travel ways, kind of the push-pull factors. If you look at crime statistics, you'll see that some crime rates are higher in some geographical locations than others, and you can start looking at, is there certain characteristics? For example, is that an area that has a lot of tourism or a lot of temporary visitors, or where people don't know each other, or is it a very dense population? I mean, you can start looking at all these factors. Some students and I were taking a look at some crime rates, and we noticed that the crime rates seem higher in areas that were a lot more fun to visit, that had a lot more activities going on, and so that's something to take a look at. Familiarity also with the roads and the highways, and also the general areas when we look at offenders. This is especially relevant in cases where there are certain transportation modes that the offender could take that would really be difficult for us to follow, or different roads or patterns. I remember one case that I was interviewed about. The big question was whether the offender had an automobile or a boat or both. That we were wondering, a body was discovered by basically on the shore of a lake, and we're trying to figure out, well, did that body get there by someone carrying it from parking somewhere? Did they pull right up to the lake, or did they take a boat and then dispose of the body at that particular point? They ended up using an automobile. And it was a relatively heavily traveled area as well. So that leads to some issues as well. Also, the number and types of barriers, the alternate routes, and also the mental maps that offenders use. Offenders have mental maps that they use. In fact, we all have mental maps when it comes to geographical aspects, and obviously offenders do as well. With geographical patterns, we're trying to predict offender mobility and crime site geography. And when the offender succeeds in committing crimes, they may actually move farther from home or work. And so what we want to try to figure out, looking at crimes, especially if we're linking them, it's probably the same offender, or a good probability it's the same offender. We want to look at their comfort zone and see if that stays around the same, and so on. Also, the elements in geographic profiling, for example, the distance. I mentioned the perception of distance differs for each person. Also, the method of transportation, and also includes the criminal's perception of the distance related to the mode of transportation. And as I mentioned, the attractiveness of the origins, destinations, and travel ways. Again, perception is everything here. So that's just kind of to review what I already mentioned. Also, familiarity, I mentioned the number and types of barriers, such as rivers, freeways, state lines, whether there's alternate routes, and so on. And so when we look at mental maps, we have the cognitive images of our surroundings: location of residence, locations of friends' homes, work location, location of recreational outlets, paths, nodes, landmarks for reference points. So we have a lot of this to address as well. It's interesting to look at how all this relates, especially in a location or city of rapid change. It gets a little bit complex there. I remember years ago I was driving in North Florida and I got lost, and I asked someone at a small store for directions, and they actually didn't give me street names, but they gave me landmarks. They said, go about a mile down the road and you'll see an old red barn with half the roof missing. Make a right on that street. Go for about a half a mile and you'll see basically a fence that's halfway down. Make a left, and so on, versus someone who tells you the streets, or someone who tells you different coordinates in some ways, or landmarks. Make a left at the fountain, and then a right at the railroad tracks, and so on. And so we want to look at all that related to the use of highways and roads, for example, to find victims, but also to escape law enforcement. And also, we want to ask ourselves why an offender selects a specific neighborhood, dump site, or travel route. Is there something going on there? A lot of times, offenders will commit crimes close to their home or close to their work. The elements in geographic profiling continued, the geography and the victim selection. So we want to try to understand the offender's spatial decision-making process. We want to try to understand how the offender thinks. We're not trying to get into the offender's head. That we don't do. We don't think like the offender. What we want to do is understand how the offender thinks. How does the offender's travel patterns vary? When we look at serial murder, for example, and we look at highway and trucking routes and things of that nature, it's very different when you look at, large city compact area that happens to have serial crime going on. So we want to look at the offender's geographic zones in which the crimes are committed. And we want to see if the crimes are similar. Can we link them? But we also want to be aware there may be copycat crimes. We want to see if their method of operation change. As discussed before, the method of operation might change as they become more adept, but if there's some signatures, they usually will stay consistent or the same. And then we can use linkage analysis to compare similar crimes in different locations. And so again, a lot of aspects that we use in our crime mapping, looking at the types of crimes, roads and highways, physical and psychological boundaries, land use, neighborhood demographics, routine activities of victims and routine activities of people in general. Also displacement, the offender moving their locations of their criminal behavior. We want to look at the encounter site where the perpetrator first contacts the victims, the attack site where the first attack occurs, and then the crime site, the location of the actual crime. and the victim disposal site if that's the case, or vehicle dump site if that's the case. And please note that crime locations may or may not be the same. Also, we have computerized geographical analysis, which kind of I've been talking about, alluding to through the whole presentation, where we can analyze the spatial characteristics. This helps to create investigative strategies, including patrol and stakeouts, canvassing and area searches, suspect prioritization, searching outside of agency databases for information, task force prioritization, and so forth. Also reviewing case files, examining crime scenes and area photographs, interviewing people, witnesses, suspects, visiting crime site locations, analyzing demographic data, analysis of land use, and so on. A lot of this all now integrated into crime mapping systems. We actually have at the undergraduate level and the graduate level crime mapping certifications. Now you can get a crime map. Now, at the undergraduate level, you have to be in our, you have to be a UCF undergraduate student in any program to get that certificate. But the graduate level crime mapping certificate is indeed a standalone, and so you can find this information at the ucf.edu website if you're interested in looking into this. Sorry for that little marketing there, but I mean that's how important it is that we actually have certification programs, and a lot of departments have GIS certification programs, whether it's anthropology or sociology, for example, or public administration. But I mean a lot of programs do now. Obviously geography, where it all started, geography programs. And then linking crimes. A lot of that's really important. Using all these databases, communicating with other agencies and professionals, putting it all together and seeing, what we got there in regards to figuring out if there's similar, if it's the same perpetrator or maybe an organized group of perpetrators committing these crimes. You hear like 30 cars are broken into in a half-mile radius between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. You start thinking, well, it's probably a small group of people, and you find out that happened in one town, and then 50 miles away it happened last weekend, and then 50 miles from that it happened 2 weekends. You start putting the pieces together. Now, also technology in the future. We'll start discussing that toward the end of this chapter. Obviously, GPS devices and mapping programs I mentioned, but also integrating social networking sites, satellite imagery, surveillance video, as well as other sources. I can tell you in one case that I followed and I was interviewed about, they actually caught the perpetrator because they were able to find out the last calls made to the victim's cell phone, and then they tracked the perpetrator down through getting the address based on the cell phone records, and then finding evidence there to make an arrest. I have a few minutes. I wanted to just bring in some additional material. Found an article, short article from written by Bunch, Kim, and Brunelli, published in 2017, titled "Under Our Nose: The Use of GIS Technology in Case Notes to Focus Search Efforts," from the Journal of Forensic Sciences, Volume 62, Number 1, pages 92 to 98. They talk in this particular article, they address using GIS to locate homicide victims. And so it's really important to have a very quick response. And many people that go missing either return on their own or are found. But in child abduction cases, the child is likely to be killed within 3 hours. And so time is really important here. And so we have new technology and techniques that may be used once an area of interest has been identified. And so the big question is, how do we narrow down a search? And so these authors talk about some of the research that they've conducted and reviewed some of the research. And for example, that some of the research focuses on the distance from the location where the victim was last seen, the VLS, where the victim was last seen, and where the body was recovered, BR, the body recovery. And the authors looked at cases from upstate New York, had a nice sample, and they looked at homicides, suicides, accidental deaths, and those that were undetermined. That's always very relevant as too. If someone goes missing, you know, we wonder, is it a homicide? Is it a suicide? Is it accidental death? Is it undetermined? They report that in their study, that body was recovered in about half of the cases within 5 days, and the distance from where the victim was last seen and the body recovery was within a 2-mile radius in 35% of the cases, and in 57% of the cases within 5 miles. So there we begin to look in a relatively small area to start with. Also, they noted that accidents were closer than homicides and suicides in regards to VLS and BR. And also they talked about how we need to also look carefully at clandestine locations where there's a lot of tree coverage, water areas, and enclosed spaces. I can tell you, once I was working on a case as a forensic counselor, and I sent some law enforcement officers, recommended some law enforcement officers go into a swamp to collect some evidence, and they were not happy with me, but they found what they were looking for in the areas, and I was able to give them some ideas about some hidden areas and where to look, and they indeed found some evidence in a very remote area. Okay, using GIS to locate victims. Again, the VLS and the BR, where the victim was last seen and the body recovery, tends to be very close. So we can use maps to evaluate this along a 5-mile radius with a focus on secluded areas, and then expand that maybe to 10 miles if needed. The authors, interestingly enough, do not recommend drone technology in these cases, primarily because of the effort to hide the body, either bury the body, hide the body in trees underneath, bridges, and so on. Now, obviously, if someone's missing, maybe they're hiking, and then you might want to use drone technology, thinking that they're going to be out in the open or trying to be seen. But in these other cases, it's a different story. I actually do recommend using drones along with cell phone GPS analysis if possible, but there's a lot of debate about that. And I think I'm just saying to use drones because it's just one more possibility you might see something that you may not have otherwise. So there's some debate about that, and it's okay for scientists to disagree and debate. Anyway, that is really my update on the geographical profiling chapter, chapter 12, geography profiling and predatory criminals. There's so much technology that has now been implemented. Just to tell you real briefly, years ago I remember my colleague had a map of the area that we serviced when I worked in as a forensic counselor on a sex crimes unit, and he had all these push pins in the general streets where the crimes occurred to kind of find patterns and everything. Green, red, blue, yellow, the pinheads, represented a different type of crime, and he had that thing up there, and then one day, I don't know what happened, it fell down. It was tacked into bulletin board, cork bulletin board, it fell down, and the pins scattered, and always back up your data. Anyway, again, you really need to keep up on the literature in this area because it's always changing, and this wraps up this video. Thank you.